Caitlin, what's the status of your health right now, and what specifically injury-wise between the ankle and the groin was it that prevented you from coming back this year?
Yeah, honestly, I've been working really hard to...
The roar of the crowd is usually deafening when she steps onto the hardwood, a chaotic symphony of thousands of fans who traveled across the country just to catch a glimpse of the phenomenon in action. But on this particular night, a heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the arena as the broadcast camera zoomed in on the sideline. There sat Caitlin Clark, the most electrifying and commercially dominant player of her generation, draped in a towel, staring blankly ahead after being abruptly pulled from the game by her own head coach during a critical, momentum-shifting stretch. The fans in the stands and the millions watching at home immediately erupted, flooding timelines and message boards with absolute outrage as they watched the undisputed face of the entire league get benched while the team struggled to find an offensive rhythm. It wasn't a medical issue, it wasn't a necessary breather, and it certainly wasn't a lack of effort that put the record-breaking rookie on the pine while her team desperately needed a spark. Instead, it looked to the entire basketball world like a deeply calculated, profoundly stubborn move by a coaching staff that fundamentally misunderstood the generational, once-in-a-lifetime talent they had miraculously been gifted in the draft. People across the sports landscape generally expect a rookie to simply nod, take the harsh lesson, and fall back into line like every other first-year player who had ever entered the professional ranks before her. But Caitlin isn't every other player, and the standard rules of quiet compliance simply do not apply to someone carrying the financial weight of an entire organization on her shoulders. In the immediate aftermath of this highly controversial and baffling sideline decision, she finally broke her silence, dropping a massive, heavily analyzed statement that sent absolute shockwaves through the front office and left everyone wondering if her time with the Indiana Fever was already coming to a sudden, dramatic, and catastrophic end. And the disturbing truth behind why she was really taken off the court that night, and what she said immediately afterward, is much darker and more complex than a simple, everyday coaching adjustment. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of what is currently unspooling behind closed doors, you have to look closely at the bizarre, almost toxic dynamic between the superstar point guard and her head coach, Christy Sides. From the very first tip-off of the season, it felt like two completely different, utterly incompatible basketball philosophies were violently colliding in the most destructive way possible on national television. On one hand, you have a transformative player who completely revolutionized the college game with impossibly deep three-pointers, mesmerizing transition passes, and a relentless, high-octane pace that exhausted defenders and captivated millions of viewers globally. On the other hand, you have a head coach desperately trying to force that exact same transcendent player into a rigid, slow, archaic, defensive-heavy system that actively strips away absolutely everything that makes her a special, unstoppable force on the court. During multiple games throughout the grueling season, viewers watched in absolute disbelief as Caitlin was visibly reprimanded, scolded, and ultimately benched for taking the exact same deep, momentum-shifting shots that made her a global phenomenon in the first place. The benching incident wasn't just an isolated mistake or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the explosive boiling point of a massive, season-long power struggle between an old-school mentality and a new-age superstar. Insiders from within the organization began to whisper to the press that the coaching staff felt an urgent, almost ego-driven need to humble the wildly popular rookie to firmly prove that the professional league was a completely different beast, and that absolutely no one was bigger than the coach's system. But this incredibly stubborn mentality drastically backfired, bleeding into the team's performance and entirely alienating the very player who was keeping the franchise relevant. The frustration on the court became completely palpable to anyone watching, with eagle-eyed fans heavily analyzing every single eye roll, every exasperated sigh, and every glaring moment of miscommunication between the bench and the floor. But this severe disconnect with the coaching staff was truly only the tip of the iceberg, because what was happening to her when the whistle actually blew was even more disturbing and physically dangerous. Life in the professional ranks, with a massive target on her back, quickly turned into an absolute physical nightmare for the rookie, and the staggering lack of support she received from her own locker room shocked analysts and fans alike. Night after relentless night, she was subjected to brutal, bone-rattling screens, unnecessarily late hits, and blatant cheap shots from opposing players that somehow went entirely ignored by the referees, who were supposed to be protecting the players. Opposing veterans seemed to make it their personal, deeply vindictive mission to welcome her to the league in the harshest, most punishing way legally possible, treating her less like a fellow competitor and much more like a human punching bag. But the most alarming and controversial part of this hazing wasn't just the blatant physicality of the hostile opponents. It was the completely deafening, terrifying silence from her own squad when she was repeatedly knocked to the hardwood. In the early, highly scrutinized months of the season, when she was aggressively shoved to the floor by completely uncalled fouls, there were no teammates instantly rushing over to pull her back up to her feet or get aggressively in the face of the offender to establish dominance. She was left entirely isolated on a lonely island, fighting a brutal, physically exhausting one-woman battle against seasoned veterans who clearly carried a massive, deep-rooted chip on their shoulders regarding her unprecedented, record-breaking popularity. It painted a remarkably grim, depressing picture of the team's locker room chemistry and fueled intense, widespread speculation that the veteran players deeply resented the overwhelming media circus and paparazzi that followed her every single move. The severe mental toll of having to produce historic, franchise-saving numbers while simultaneously constantly watching your own back, knowing your supposed enforcers might not even step up to protect you, is completely unimaginable for a young player just trying to find her footing. This glaring lack of protection created a highly toxic, hostile work environment that essentially forced her into a perpetual state of survival mode, and it was only a matter of time before the deep psychological cracks in her armor began to show to the public. Yet, the intense hostility she faced from opposing rosters and the bizarre coldness from her own teammates was just a highly visible symptom of a much larger, institutionalized disease rotting the league from the inside out. The harsh, undeniable reality of this entire situation is that the deeply entrenched basketball establishment was absolutely never truly ready for someone to completely eclipse them in popularity, and they allowed their bitter jealousy to dictate their public actions. You could clearly hear the resentment brewing in the heavily passive-aggressive comments made by former basketball legends during national television broadcasts, the constant, exhausting downplaying of her historical impact, and the sheer, stubborn reluctance to give her any actual credit for the massive financial boom the entire sport was suddenly experiencing. But the ultimate, unforgettable slap in the face came directly from the highest levels of the sport's national committee when the Summer Global Games approached. Despite single-handedly driving record-breaking television ratings, completely selling out massive arenas nationwide, and being the sole catalyst for bringing private charter flights to a league that previously adamantly refused to fund them, she was shockingly and unceremoniously left completely off the national team roster. The establishment desperately claimed to the angry press that it was purely a matter of veteran experience and specific roster fit. But to the rest of the viewing world, it looked exactly like a blatant, coordinated attempt by the old guard to keep her firmly in her place and deny her the ultimate global stage. This massive rejection was a catastrophic turning point in her relationship with the basketball world, signaling to her that no matter how many expensive tickets she sold, and no matter how many legendary records she shattered, the entrenched establishment would always view her as an unwelcome outsider disrupting their comfortable club. Imagine carrying the entire economic weight and future viability of a professional league firmly on your own two shoulders, only to be bluntly told you simply aren't good enough to sit at their most prestigious, globally televised table. This profound, highly publicized disrespect fundamentally shifted something deep within her mindset, completely altering how she viewed her employer and her future in the sport. The unwavering, almost naive loyalty she initially brought into her professional career began to rapidly wane, quickly replaced by a cold, highly calculated realization that she desperately needed to prioritize her own brand and mental health, because the institution certainly wasn't going to do it for her. And that pivotal, life-altering realization finally culminated in a highly anticipated press conference that completely derailed the media narrative and left seasoned sports reporters completely speechless. Following a grueling, physically draining stretch of games and yet another highly controversial moment of being unjustly sidelined by her coaching staff, she sat heavily in front of the blinding media microphones and finally let the polished, PR-friendly facade drop entirely. She absolutely refused to offer the usual, highly sanitized, aggressively trained answers about trusting the long-term process, executing the coach's vision, or focusing on team unity. Instead, she looked incredibly, deeply exhausted, physically drained of her usual vibrant energy, and spoke with a terrifyingly blunt honesty that instantly sent a massive, undeniable warning signal straight to the team's wealthy ownership group. She explicitly stated to the quiet room that she was completely exhausted, heavily burdened both physically and mentally from the non-stop, incredibly chaotic media and physical grind she had been forcefully enduring for over a year straight without a single break. She deliberately mentioned desperately needing to step away from the game, to completely disconnect from the deafening outside noise, and to deeply, carefully evaluate exactly what was best for her own personal future and long-term well-being. While on the absolute surface, to a casual viewer, it might have sounded like a young, overworked player just desperately pleading for an off-season break, those deeply entrenched in the sports business world, heavily analyzing the situation, read exactly between the lines. It was a massive, highly calculated, incredibly dangerous statement of leverage aimed directly at the people signing her comparatively minuscule paychecks. She was effectively and publicly telling the Indiana front office that the current, highly toxic conditions, the wildly questionable coaching tactics, the terrifying lack of on-court physical protection, the deeply suffocating media pressure, and the blatant disrespect were entirely, fundamentally unsustainable for her future. The heavy, unwritten message hanging in the air was loud, clear, and completely terrifying for the executives. If things do not drastically and immediately change to her liking, she has absolutely no legal or moral obligation to stick around and continue being the punching bag for a franchise that doesn't even know how to properly utilize her talents. And the truly terrifying, sleep-depriving part for the Fever management and the league commissioner is that she actually has the massive financial means and global influence to simply walk away from their league completely. As the loud, persistent whispers of her deep discontent grew louder across the sports landscape, a highly lucrative, entirely viable escape route suddenly and dramatically materialized in the background, offering her a golden ticket out of her current misery. A brand new, heavily funded, wildly ambitious alternative 3-on-3 basketball league, heavily backed by massive private equity and founded by top-tier professional players, completely disillusioned with the current system, began making massive international headlines. Huge, undeniable rumors exploded across social media and sports networks that this new renegade organization, aggressively branded as Unrivaled, was silently preparing a record-shattering, completely unprecedented multi-million-dollar offer specifically designed to lure her away from the traditional, restrictive ecosystem. This massive financial proposal wasn't just about playing a few casual off-season games to stay in shape. It was about presenting a completely different, vastly superior reality, where she would be treated like the global icon she actually is. In this new, highly disruptive league, she wouldn't just be a severely underpaid employee. She would reportedly have a massive, life-changing equity stake in the company. Absolute, undisputed creative control over her own personal brand, and a hand-picked roster of players who actually desperately wanted to play alongside her rather than tear her down out of spite. The staggering financial package allegedly being prepared behind closed doors completely dwarfed absolutely anything her incredibly restrictive, embarrassingly low-paying current rookie contract could ever possibly provide in a lifetime of playing. Suddenly, the entire power narrative surrounding her future flipped entirely upside down, sending absolute shockwaves through the traditional basketball establishment. The terrifying threat of her actually leaving the Fever wasn't just angry, delusional fan speculation or internet message board gossip anymore. It was a legitimate, heavily funded, highly realistic possibility backed by billionaires. She could simply choose to completely ignore the heavily flawed traditional path, take the massive generational payout, and comfortably play in an exclusive, highly protected environment that actually respects and worships her undeniable star power. This shocking revelation turned the league's entire power dynamic completely on its head, definitively proving to the world that she doesn't need the traditional, heavily flawed league structure to maintain her massive celebrity status. But they desperately, fundamentally need her just to financially survive. Behind closed, heavily guarded doors in corporate offices, the sudden, terrifying realization of this rapidly shifting power dynamic sent the team's wealthy executives and the league's highest-ranking officials into an absolute, unmitigated state of sheer panic. The Indiana franchise went from being a completely forgotten, financially struggling Midwestern market to the absolute undisputed center of the entire global sports universe virtually overnight, entirely and exclusively because of her mere presence on their roster. Season ticket sales violently skyrocketed to unprecedented, record-breaking levels. Official team merchandise completely vanished from physical and digital shelves vastly faster than it could possibly be manufactured. And local city businesses saw an entirely unprecedented, massive economic boom simply because she was playing in their downtown arena. To carelessly lose absolutely all of that incredible billion-dollar momentum simply because a remarkably stubborn head coach wanted to foolishly prove a petty point about defensive rotations, or because the incompetent front office utterly failed to properly surround her with the right physical support system, would instantly go down as the single biggest, most embarrassing administrative failure in the entire history of modern professional sports. High-ranking executives suddenly found themselves desperately scrambling, hastily convening emergency, late-night board meetings to frantically figure out exactly how to salvage this rapidly deteriorating relationship before the catastrophic damage became entirely irreversible, and she walked out the door forever. They are acutely, painfully aware that if she ever formally requests a highly publicized trade, or exponentially worse, actually decides to completely step away from their hardwood entirely, to aggressively pursue these alternative, incredibly lucrative million-dollar ventures, the franchise's total financial valuation will violently plummet into the ground overnight. The intense, suffocating pressure is absolutely no longer on the young rookie to quietly adapt to the harsh, unforgiving professional game. The immense pressure is now entirely and squarely on the nervous billionaires sitting comfortably in their luxury skyboxes to immediately fix the colossal mess they arrogantly allowed to happen under their watch. They are desperately holding on to a priceless, once-in-a-century golden ticket, and they are completely, visibly terrified of dropping it into the mud due to their own sheer incompetence. Furthermore, the massive television broadcast partners who recently inked historically massive, multi-billion-dollar rights deals with the league based almost entirely on the projection